Welcome to MTA International Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland. This is Open Forum. Today we're going to talk about migration and integration. There are migration patterns all around the world for years and years. This is not just a recent phenomena. People have been migrating for centuries. And then we're going to go into how once a group migrates, how do they integrate in their new homeland, how the locals react, and how the immigrants should react in order to create a more peaceful society. I have three great guests here today. To my right is Irfan Al-Adin, who is from New York City. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir.
Next, we have Mahmoud Ahmed, who's from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And we have Chaudhary from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Mahmoud, we'll start with you. Tell us about this phenomena of migration. It's been happening for centuries. Can you just break down why, how, what makes people migrate?
Well, I'll correct you first. It's not happening. It hasn't been happening for centuries. It's happening for millennia. I mean, human beings started out by the spread of the human race. If you believe most theories, the human race started out somewhere, maybe in Africa, East Africa, and then being spread all over the globe. And the way that they did so was by migration. And so North America, where we're sitting here and recording this right now, was populated initially by migrants from, what was people who came up through the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. And eventually that populated the entire North American continent. So that puts in context this idea that migration is not a newfound phenomenon, but something that is a permanent feature of the human condition.
And if I can give us an example of some people that have migrated throughout history.
Sure. I mean, you have some that are forced. This is a very good example here of not of the forced, but of those coming from Asia and coming across the Alaskan land bridge and settling into North and South America. And those are basically...
Wait, there was an Alaskan land bridge?
There was. Actually, Siberia was connected to Alaska by about a 35 or 40 mile bridge. And then over time, as the sea levels rose, that bridge eroded. Wow. But back then there was a connection, and they say about up to 112 million Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere, which were nearly exterminated by the Europeans who had come in. So this concept of migration...
So the Europeans migrated to
that's right.
as well then.
The Europeans are newcomers. They say actually there were Africans who came here even before the Native Americans. And like I said, the Europeans are the last wave. Exactly. Yeah. So it's a lot of the people who say that, well, why have these new people coming in? They themselves are new people.
Interesting. Actually, give us some more examples of these migration patterns.
Yeah, we certainly have the Europeans, but more recently we've had coming into the United States a lot of migrants coming from South and Central America. In many cases over there, they're trying to escape not just poverty and economic hardship, but actual political hardship, where there's a lot of violence, political violence, and they're trying to escape that and make a better life for their families. So that's what we've been seeing, in the United States, and that's where a lot of the fear comes in from.
So the causes, if there's political hardship, then you've got the Uyghur Muslims. You've got individuals in present-day Myanmar. What's going on there? What's driving these political realities of how people are getting pushed out of their countries as well?
Yeah, so it's been happening again for not just hundreds but thousands of years. When you look at the Pilgrims who came to the United States early on and from Europe, they were escaping religious persecution. And so religious persecution has been happening currently, but it's one of the main driving factors of why people are leaving their country, whether it's Syria or whether it's China or whether it's other countries where Muslims and other groups as well are being persecuted for their faith. They're trying to find a different land where they can openly practice their faith.
So what's going on in China and Syria? I mean, let's talk about the Muslims that are being pushed. China, Syria, Myanmar, what's going on there? I mean, you would think it would be one I'd get, but it seems like there's a pattern.
Well, certainly I think that there is a pattern of people who are in a minority within a particular country who are being persecuted. That's really the pattern, right? So you can look at it globally. You look at China, for example. You have the Uyghur Muslims. They are ethnically different than many other Chinese.
They are Chinese.
Turkish.
Some of them believe,
Turkish?
yeah, some of them self-identify as Chinese. Many other self-identify as Turkic, which is part of the dynamic. But in any event,
But they've been there for a long time.
But they've been there for a long time, and they're being persecuted for their religion. Similarly, and many of them are being detained in internment camps. There are efforts by some authorities to re-educate them, so to speak, which is to say, basically, program children from a young age to get away from their religious faith and to stop practicing it. So that's certainly very painful and has led to a lot of people.
And what happened in Myanmar?
Somewhat similar. There's a group of the Rohingya who had been living in that country for centuries, and they have been treated as
For centuries,
absolutely, and they have
now they're just being pushed.
They're being pushed. They were bitterly persecuted by the military regime in that country, and as a result, they've been driven out. But the persecution is occurring even within Muslim-majority countries.
But
there is
come back to
persecution.
Rohingya real quick. So you've got a leader of this country who won a Nobel
Yes.
Prize, but yet there's millions being pushed. How does the world, before we get to the integration, how do we address this push?
I mean, it's incredible. I mean, what it has to do with is it's the dynamics in that country, where even a leader such as Aung San Suu Kyi, who is widely seen as being a reformer and obviously, as you said, as a Nobel laureate who got the Peace Prize, and yet there's so much what's so-called nationalist fervor in that country, against members of this minority, against Muslims, because it's a Buddhist majority country, that even a leader like her has been forced in some ways, to kowtow to that kind of mindset, and it is a failure of leadership, certainly I think on her part, as has been widely recognized. And so these are deep-seated roots of the reasons for migration.
And Emmett, you were talking about political migration earlier. So explain to me how that works.
Yeah, so politics is something that's been going on for hundreds of years, but right now there's a lot of political violence that's going on in Central and South America. And so the people who are fleeing are basically trying to get away from that violence, and they do have to go through multiple countries in order to get to the border of the United States. And so, there was a caravan that was described of this large mass of people that was slowly making their way up to the United States. And it was a political talking point for the American politicians that this is what we should be afraid of. And while at the same time, we have to be recognize that these are true refugees. They're fleeing some violence, which if they were returned to that same country, they could be killed, they could be detained, they could be, in extreme violent situations.
Before we describe what the classification is, help me understand. So if they start in a South American country and they're going through countries, why should the U.S. be the last stop? Or are they trying to travel through the U.S. to get to Canada? Are they looking for the best country to go in? It seems a little unfair from a U.S. perspective to have to take them all as well.
Yeah, no, I don't think anyone's saying they have to take all of them in, but there are some legitimate people who are fleeing violence. And so, yes, all the countries that they go through, if they have the means, they should certainly offer some sort of assistance to these people and not just give them a free ride through their country to the United States. So I think that's certainly a legitimate argument in favor of each country taking its own responsibility for people who are genuinely fleeing from violence.
So Mahmoud, explain to me how just the legal differentiation. What is a refugee? What is an asylee? What is just someone looking for economic growth, or a PhD student coming? How do you migrate from country A to country B, and what are the various classifications? It seems like this is much more complex than you get up and go.
It is very complex, and obviously it's a full employment act for a lot of lawyers. But I guess to try to sort of simplify it, there basically are two categories of people who are migrating. There are people who are migrating for opportunity. And then there are people who are, they want to go to a different country, they want to have a better life for their kids, that maybe the educational opportunities in the country that they're in are not as good. And oftentimes, there's a willing country on the other end of that spectrum. So, the United States.
So they depart with already being accepted.
Yes.
Okay.
So, for example, in the United States, historically, we have found that a great way for us to grow our economy is to have people, smart people, talented people from other countries, such as China or India or the UK or wherever, come to us, and they are, enrolling as students in our universities. They are coming and working in the technology companies in Silicon Valley, which employ many of these people. Oftentimes, you hear the term H-1B visa. That's a kind of visa that you can get to come work in the United States in that way. There's a government, quota that's set every year. That obviously it's a big policy decision of how many of those visas to give out.
So
that's
these
one
are
path.
skilled labor,
Yes.
smart people who approved by, say, the U.S.,
Yes.
UK, another country,
Right.
and they come in.
They come in. So
Okay,
that's one path.
One path, okay.
Right. The other path, and those are people who are there by invitation, right? And then there is the people.
And these, the folks that these two have talked about.
Right. And then there is the other path, which is the
Okay.
people who are fleeing some type of hardship. They're in the United Nations. Back in the 1950s, there was a convention that was adopted, and the 1951 convention, it's what it's commonly known as. And it recognizes, a couple of different grounds on which people can be classified as refugees. And so if you're fleeing because of political persecution, because of the political viewpoint that you have, you want to express is not being allowed in the country you're in, you could be fleeing religious persecution, as has been ably discussed here, people who are not allowed to practice their faith, or you could be fleeing persecution based on race, or on what's called a social group, which is you have some kind of identifying characteristic that is permanent about you, such as you are a prosecutor who was trying to convict gang members in a particular country, and suddenly they've turned on you, and as a prosecutor you can no longer live in that country.
And these are all called refugees?
These are all refugees. Now, an asylee is someone who believes they are entitled to refugee status, and so they're saying,
Two different terms, okay.
Two different terms, but the asylee is sort of trying to graduate to become a refugee, if you think about it that way. An asylee is like a student trying to become a refugee.
I see.
And so they either go to the United Nations, as is sometimes the case, or
How do you go to the United Nations?
So if you go to for example, if you live in a country like Pakistan and you are,
good example.
You are a Christian. Christians have a lot of problems in Pakistan, as do other groups like Ahmadis, and you may say, well, I need to get out of here because I'm not being allowed to practice my faith. And so you go somewhere that you can get to relatively easily. So a lot of Christians will go to a place like Thailand.
Oh, so you got to go to another country.
Yes, where you can travel without a visa.
Okay. So they go from their current country, home country, and now they're an asylee?
They're an asylee.
Okay.
And so they show up in Bangkok or wherever.
An asylee seeks asylum. I just want to get the words right.
Right.
Okay.
Seeks asylum, or in this case, seeks refugee status.
Okay.
And so they will then go to the United Nations. They have offices all over the world. There's an agency of the United Nations called the UN High Commission for Refugees. And
There's
their
a whole-
entire
okay.
business is to deal with
Interesting.
refugees. And so they will go to the UNHCR.
This did not
as it's
exist
called.
in your examples, but
No, no, it's not. Yes.
Yeah.
So they will go there and they will say, I would like to be recognized as a refugee. Now, the nice thing about that is if you are recognized as a refugee, it requires a process. You have to submit your documentation. You have to go to an interview. They have to believe that you have a legitimate claim. And if they approve you, then you are eligible for what's called resettlement. And resettlement is a concept that any country that is a member of the United Nations that wishes to take people in, that says, I have some room for people who are refugees to come to my country and live here permanently. So that is one path. The other path is, say you are, living in Syria, and you are, undergoing the war there, and it's impossible for you to live there. Maybe you're politically persecuted. You can take some measure to get out of that country and show up at the border in another country. So a lot of people, they're put on boats, and they go on a boat and they try to go to Italy or Greece or one of these countries on the Mediterranean. And what they're trying to do then is they're trying to go to that country, and they're trying to say, I want to claim asylum. In your country. And so you go directly to that country. It's a more perilous path.
Okay.
And so those are
the two
those are the
types.
two
Okay, so it's
types.
pretty complicated. So now what happens if whenever there's too many of individuals who come into a country, the quote-unquote natives of the time,
Right.
get restless, it appears.
Well, they're afraid that they're going to lose their jobs. They're afraid that their own economic status will be diminished. You want to put in a driveway, you go to the local Italian guy and or of a basically European background, and it's $28,000. You go to the guy from El Salvador, oh, that's $15,000, and he does as
So
good or
the
better.
economics gets driven down.
Exactly, and that's where the hatred is, or the xenophobia is coming from. But we have to look
It's economic.
It's economic. But if we have to look at our moral obligations as well, wherever the U.S. and the old USSR, the Cold War, was fighting in Central America and Latin America, in all of those countries, there's turmoil today. And throughout the world.
Interesting.
So it's those countries. You have Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and then Guatemala, they go through, and then up to Mexico. Why don't they stop in Guatemala? Why don't they stop in Mexico? Because those countries are almost as poor as where they came from. They come to the US of A. But some feel that we have a moral obligation because it is our political history and that of Russia that caused the turmoil that is in Central America and in Latin America and in Africa and throughout the world. So that's why some feel they have a moral obligation and others, unfortunately, do not.
Let's transition to once they're in a country, how should I be thinking about in my home country as there's an influx of people coming in, you know, my economic opportunity is going to go down, and should I fear my life?
Well, integration really is kind of, you can look at it as two kind of processes. There's the individual integration, and then there's the group integration.
Interesting. Okay.
Right? So an individual integrates into society by, you know, possibly learning the language, learning what the customs of the local area are, learning about the history of that country. You know, United States, in order to become a citizen, you have to pass an exam. That exam tests your knowledge about the history of the United States, that there are some, you know, facts and things that you have to know, the government deems, in order to become fully integrated that relate to where this nation came from. So those are individual integrative processes that have to go on.
Most countries have that, yeah.
Exactly, and I think those are very beneficial because then you're, you know, setting some sort of standard, you know, sometimes a low standard of knowledge and, you know, about where you actually are living. Then there's the group integration, and that's a more kind of dynamic and more unpredictable type of integration. Sure, it's the sum of all the individuals who are part of that group, but sometimes that dynamic can kind of overflow. And due to a few bad actors, a few people who give that group a bad name, it can make the integration of the entire group much more difficult.
But we've seen trouble with integration. Let me just throw out time when the Italians came. You know, they kind of stick together. They flow and they have their own chemistry. And you know, I mean, or you know, take any large group, not individuals, but large group that didn't come for employment, as Mahmoud said. How do you get large groups to reform and to accept the new norms of those countries?
Yeah, well, there's a constant tug of war, you know, within that group because they want to retain their own identity at the same time as integrating with the new country that's given them the opportunity. So there's a lot of dynamic that goes on over there, that what parts of your own culture, language, background do you retain?
But can you have both?
You can have both, I think. You can certainly
How does
have
one
both.
get both? You know, it's like, is it your cake and eating it too?
So, you know, one concept that the head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community has exposed is that when you move to a new country, you must have full loyalty to that country. Not to the country of your origin, that you've now come to this new country. They've given you all these benefits. They've given you a home. They've given you economic opportunity, that your loyalty to the end should be to this new home of yours, and that you're not, you know, you can certainly like and, you know, be friendly with where you came from, but now you're an American or you're an Italian or you're, you know, a British. So that's where your loyalty really needs to reside.
Let me challenge that for a second. Now, sure, you can have loyalty, but if I'm say Muslim, and I have Muslim values, and this new country just doesn't espouse it's Christian or it's Judeo-Christian or it's some other values. How can I be loyal to a country that I don't agree with their values?
The Holy Quran is very clear. Obey God and obey the messenger of God and obey those in authority over you. If your president of the country that you move is your leader, you have to obey him, the Congress and all their laws and all the leaders under at the state level, at the local level. There may be conflicts, but you have to follow the law of the land. If you're not willing to follow that law, you should not move there in the first place. Now, at that being set aside, in the U.S., there are many, many freedoms. As Muslims, for example, we have many more. Muslims have many more freedoms in America than in other countries, as I mentioned before. But the Ahmadiyya Muslims, they have many more rights in America than they do in Muslim countries. So we have to look at these positives and remember that we are not there to necessarily force anybody to adopt our ways. In fact, we should assimilate. And remember, there is no compulsion in religion. For you, your religion. For me, my religion. You can tell about what we believe. We can tell. And in the same way, they can tell us what they believe. And that is the spirit of the Prophet, is that of the Holy Quran.
So are there good integration models, as Ahmed is using the example of His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmed on having loyal, for those being integrating on refugees or asylees to be loyal to the country while the countries themselves, there's a lot of angst, there's a lot of resources, someone new comes in, you got to get them on their 2 feet, so to speak, as well. Are there good models of this?
Sure. I mean, I think in a way we saw a recent good model. It was the silver lining in a very tragic circumstance was the attack in Christchurch in New Zealand. What you saw in the aftermath of that attack was that the small country New Zealand of only
This is where the 51 people were killed at a mosque.
Two mosques. 51
mosques.
Muslims, who were worshiping. Most of them were refugees or immigrants to the country of New Zealand, which has historically been a country that has taken in, quite a few immigrants and refugees, and they were brutally gunned down by a gunman, a terrorist. And in the aftermath of that is, I think, when you saw the beauty of integration at work in a good way.
Interesting. That's where the Prime Minister,
Jacinda Ardern, came out, and she, from the get-go, defined the situation in terms that were inclusive. That she said, the Muslims who died in this attack were New Zealanders. They were members of our community, and I think that speaks to her leadership style. It speaks to the values of the people of New Zealand, but it also speaks, frankly, to the fact that the people who the Muslims who have come to that country have done a reasonably good job of integrating into New Zealand.
So help me understand. I mean, if I'm a refugee or an asylee listening to this, what are some ways that I could integrate well? I assume learning the language, being loyal to the country. What else should I be doing to assimilate?
Yeah, I mean, education is a very important aspect of this, and sometimes that is kind of more difficult the older you are if you're coming in as a grown adult. But a lot of refugees who aspire to better careers go through this education process, and it's not easy. If you look at physicians who may be physicians in other countries or dentists in other countries, once they come to this country, they have to sometimes repeat a lot of the exams, a lot of the
because
coursework.
teeth are different in other countries.
They aren't, but we, America and the United States has certain standards, and other places in Europe may have different standards. So, so they have to go through a struggle, and that's one thing refugees should definitely have kind of in their mind, that they've already gone through a lot, but once you've arrived in this country, the hard work doesn't end. And that's where we get this, kind of immigration mentality from. That this hard work mentality, really is kind of synonymous with immigrants. And so they are able to, quote unquote, work harder because they've seen what they've, left behind. And they don't want to ever kind of go back to that economic level or that political, situation. So they've been able to kind of exceed expectations by working harder. And so that's the main way I think that refugees and immigrants can really kind of integrate into society.
And that's a great point on that side. Now let's go back to the side of the governments. His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the leader of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, has advised governments as well how to not hurt sentiment, how to help. What has he done to share, to guide governments to accept this as well? Ahmad summarized really well. I mean, education, there's a lot of things. What did His Holiness say to the governments?
He said governments need to make policies that establish and protect mutual respect, through which hurting the sentiments of others or causing them any type of harm should be outlawed. With regard to the immigrants, they must enter with a willingness to integrate with the local people, whilst the locals should be ready to open their hearts and display tolerance.
So that's a great quote to kind of bookend this on. Quick thoughts on advice to governments and individuals that may be in this situation. We'll start with you, Ahmed.
There's a famous quote from a very famous Broadway play that's going on right now. It says, "Immigrants, we get the job done," right? And immigrants should be willing to come in and work hard and integrate with the society that they're coming to because they want to get the job done.
Get the job done.
And I think to pick up on that, conversely, governments should look at immigrants as an asset. They should look at them as a way for their country to grow. Every person who comes into a country, every group that comes into a country brings something new, something valuable that can help everybody in that country. And that's I think, a great way.
That's a growth area.
Better to have immigrants than emigrants, because that's what's happening in Western Europe. There's just a depletion in the population. And if you deplete too much and you have an older population, the country goes into a downfall.
Wow, so that's the extreme other example as well. Thank you all for being here today. We talked about migration and integration. We learned about migration patterns all around the world. We learned about refugees and seeking asylum. And then we learned about once these individuals come to a country, how do they assimilate, how do they come in, and how do they adopt their new country and be loyal to that country, and how can countries be more accepting and have laws that allow individuals to come in. And we end with, it's better to have immigration than emigration. So it's a way the world works, and I hope you've enjoyed MTA International Open Forum in our studios in Silver Spring, Maryland.